you.
Thanks everyone for coming. My name is Zach Subin. I'm one of the leads of Urban Environmentalists. We're a new group of volunteers based in the Bay Area. We've just been formed a little over 6 months ago to take action on the linked crises of housing and climate. We have copies of our draft platform that you can grab on your way out. And please feel free to join us at an event in the near future to help us shape our work. I'd also like to thank our co-hosts and organizers, Spur, Transform, and the Bay Area Housing Action Coalition. The Bay Area Housing Advocacy Coalition. And we also have some sponsors listed in our programs. So now I'm going to introduce David Garcia, who's going to be the moderator for our panel. David is the policy director for the UC Berkeley Turner Center. He leads the center's engagement in local, state, and federal policy and supports the generation of research-driven policy ideas, proposals, and papers. And he and his colleagues have been doing some incredible work, better understanding our housing crisis and moving the conversation forward. Thanks, David, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Zach. Yeah, let's give him a round of applause. So thanks again to Zach. I will try to, we'll all try to speak directly into the mic to compete with the concert going on across the street. We'll keep it lively. So again, my name is David Garcia. I am the policy director at the Turner Center. For those of you who are not familiar with the Turner Center, really quickly, we are a housing research and policy organization at UC Berkeley. When we live both in the College of Environmental Design as well as the Haas School of Business, and we really focus on conducting research and policy formulation that can have an impact on the housing crisis, not just in California, but nationwide. So that is a little bit about the work that we do. A couple housekeeping items before we get started. So we're going to start our discussion with a short presentation by each of our panelists, talking a little bit about the work that they do and really what their perspectives are on how housing policy is also climate policy and vice versa. And then from there, we'll go into a more kind of formal discussion amongst the whole group. We'll also be taking questions from the audience, so you should have comment cards at your seat, and you can fill them out throughout the conversation and hand them to our volunteers around the room, and then we'll try and consolidate and pick as many as we can so that we can have a more of a interactive conversation. And also, because if it's not on Twitter, it doesn't happen. So please, if you feel so compelled, please tweet at hashtag housing climate policy. You could also tag Zach's group at Urban Enviro CA. So feel free to do that as well. Also, we are live streaming, so keep that in mind too. If you find this compelling, you can let others know to check out this conversation we're having here this evening. So, but before I turn it over to the panelists to go over their presentations, I want to give a brief introduction of each. And so first we have Bruce Nilles, who you can remember that name, I've been told by Bruce, that it is like Bruce Willis except with an N. So, and Bruce is the managing director at the Rocky Mountain Institute, where he heads up a new building electrification program working to replace the burning of fossil fuels in 70 million U.S. buildings with clean and affordable electric appliances. And prior to joining the Rocky Mountain Institute last year, Bruce built and led Sierra Club's Beyond Coal campaign, a nationwide campaign to replace coal-fired power plants with clean electricity. Next to Bruce, we have Chris Jones, and Chris is the director of the Cool Climate Network, which is an academic government business NGO partnership located at UC Berkeley, and Chris is a leading expert in carbon footprint analysis and the design and evaluation of behavior-based programs. And then lastly but not least, we have Nina Rizzo. Nina is the Green Trip Certification Program Manager And she has multi-sector experience working on projects and research related to transportation, housing, and solar energy. And her enthusiasm for transportation issues actually began when she was at the California Governor's Office of Planning and Research, and they asked her to study the potential impacts of autonomous vehicles on land use, climate change, and social equity. So we have, I'm incredibly honored and lucky to be joined by three really experts in the field, and I really look forward to our conversation. But a real quick kind of, setting the table for why we're here, right? I mean, the title of the event kind of says it all, like how is housing policy, climate policy, and vice versa. And I think for a lot of people, it makes a lot of sense, right? Housing and climate are inextricably linked. The housing policy has implications for transportation, greenhouse gas emissions, land use patterns that impact not just the cost of housing or where housing gets built, but they have actual climate implications that are really important, particularly in the state of California, which has really lofty environmental goals. One of the problems that we see at the Turner Center that I see in my work is that even though the science and the data is overwhelming that these two issues are inextricably linked, the conversations around these two topics oftentimes happen in silos. So we have a lot of policies that aim to reduce greenhouse gas emissions or aim to build more housing, but they do not always happen in the same room or with the same people. And that is a challenge because they are so overlapping. And if we do not plan for these two issues concurrently with an understanding of how they interact with each other, we're at risk of not meeting any of our goals. And so really, I'm looking forward to this conversation and digging into how can we do this better as a state, and also really what does the evidence tell us we should be doing overall on both of these fronts. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Bruce to give his opening remarks, and we'll go down the table from there.
Thank you. So these are the strangest of times. The science is kind of overwhelming. The latest word is that if we stopped emitting today, the Arctic ice sheet will be gone, regardless of what we did from here on out. And likely the coral reefs are also gone. The effects of climate are here and now, and we're being reminded by teenagers that we haven't been winning this fight. And part of it is that we haven't been clear around what we need to do. So 2 years ago, I was working on coal-fired power plants, which at the time were one of the biggest sources of air pollution in the country. And as you know, there's no coal plants left in California. And I was meeting with our California team talking about gas-fired power plants to produce electricity. And one of my colleagues said, you know, we burn more gas in our buildings in California than we do in all of our power plants. I thought I misheard her. It never occurred to me that we're burning a ridiculous amount of natural gas, one of the 3 fossil fuels, in our buildings. And she went on to say that half that gas use is to heat hot water. We can't work out how to solve this climate crisis we can't work out how to heat our hot water without frying the planet. This is not that hard. But we haven't been focused on the fact that the way we power our buildings is an inextricable part of the problem of trying to address the climate change challenge. And right here in Oakland, we have an awesome city that is deeply committed to solving the climate crisis. 2 years ago, Bloomberg Associates did an assessment of how's Oakland doing? How are we doing here to do our part in the absence of federal leadership? And they gave a very sober assessment that we're not going to meet our 2020 targets. We're not going to meet our 2025 targets. And we're not going to meet our 2030 targets. And the primary reason is we have 170,000 buildings that are burning natural gas, and we have not been talking about how to solve that problem. So climate and housing are inextricably linked. The good news is we are building, finally, buildings here in Oakland, but every one of them, almost to a T, or almost all of them, are being powered by gas. So we have this awesome opportunity that's right in front of us. It doesn't require leadership from Washington, but it requires us to link housing and climate in ways that we have barely begun to scratch the surface on. The good news is this is, at its core, super simple. It never occurred to me the 4 gas appliances in my home were the biggest piece of my carbon footprint other than my flying, But replacing 4 appliances is actually fairly simple at the individual level. A gas stove, a gas dryer, furnace, and hot water heater. The trick is making it economical so that we can all do it and we all can do our part to get gas out of our cities. The other fantastic news, if we do this and get it right, is that it turns out that the gas that we burn in our buildings is a big part of the air pollution that thwarts our cities and makes it unsafe to breathe on way too many days of the year. And thirdly, the burning of gas actually inside our buildings is a much bigger health hazard than we've ever talked about. Our buildings have been getting tighter because of efficiency code, which is a good thing because we're using less energy and they are more sustainable. But we're also burning gas on our gas stoves, oftentimes without venting. And the good folks at Lawrence Berkeley Labs just down the street here put out a report 4 years ago saying the gas in our homes in the wintertime from the gas stove, when we close our windows, is exposing 12 million of us in California to levels of air pollution that would be illegal outdoors. So this profound issue of health and asthma and air pollution, again, tied to the use of gas in our buildings. So we have this really exciting opportunity to fix something that is right in front of us that is driving a big piece of the climate crisis. It is a profound health issue. It's a profound livability issue in our cities. And cities are beginning to lead. Last 4 months ago, the city of Berkeley became the first country, we think, in the world to ban gas in new buildings, a critical first step. So starting next year, January 1, you won't be able to add fossil fuels into any new building in Berkeley. Another 9 jurisdictions have followed suit, and Oakland is on track to do something by the end of this year, San Francisco hopefully not long thereafter, and we may have 40% of the state in a very short amount of time where you can no longer build new buildings powered by fossil fuels, which would be a profound shift from where we are today, which is the default being gas. So I want to leave you with the thought that we have this huge opportunity with profound livability impacts for our cities, the air that we breathe, the places we live, addressing our climate, and also as we think about the urgency of the housing crisis, how do we get these two things linked up so that they're no longer, as David mentioned, separately? We're actually thinking about how to solve these two problems together and make a remarkable improvement in the quality of life here in our cities. Thank you.
So thank you, Bruce. Real quick follow-up, and I'm going to ask a couple follow-ups of each of our panelists as they go through the presentations. But at Turner, we talk a lot about the rising costs of construction, right? And how that plays a big role in combating our housing shortage here in California. So can you speak to the upfront cost implications of ditching gas for electric in new buildings? Do we see any savings? If so, is it a significant amount? Because this might be the rare time where we actually have a mandate that actually makes housing cheaper to build.
Yeah, no, it's a great question and a really important one. So it turns out that building homes without 2 separate infrastructures is cheaper. Running electricity and gas in a building is actually more expensive than running just electricity. For the simple reason that you have to get gas from the street to the meter. You have to put the gas pipes in a building. And then every gas appliance, except for your gas stove, has to get vented outdoors. So if you have a hot water heater in your basement or your attic or a closet, there actually has to be a chimney, which is significant additional cost. You don't have to have that if you have an electric appliance. So building with gas is more expensive. Now, there's a very important caveat, which is the gas utilities have done a brilliant job of socializing those costs. So I was in Minneapolis recently meeting with a bunch of developers talking about this issue. Why are you using gas? And every one of them said, because the utility pays us to. So as we think about costs, it's important to sort of pull back the conversation and say, it is cheaper. How do we align our incentives? How do we align our programs? So in fact, it is cheaper and consumers are ending up paying more and we're not somehow socializing the infrastructure, fossil fuel infrastructure, in a way that it may be hidden.
Thank you very much, Bruce. We'll go over now to Chris.
Thank you for that. So I'm going to start with what I'm calling my MidCareer Crisis slide. This is California's greenhouse gas emissions, the blue up on the top there, and we're kind of on that green line, or maybe on that gray line there, to meet that bubble, which is the 2020 target, which we've already met. That's great. But in order to meet our 2030 target, and then again our 2050 target, we need a 5% annual reduction in greenhouse gas emissions economy-wide. The only time we've ever achieved 5% greenhouse gas reductions was during the Great Recession. So we need the equivalent of a Great Recession impact on greenhouse gas emissions every year, compounded upon itself for 30 years in order to meet our targets. And the question, that's the midlife crisis question, is, am I doing enough? Are we doing enough? Is California doing enough? And then when you compare California's emissions to the US emissions, we're not doing much better than the US overall. So we're about 2% below 1990 levels by now, but the US is only 1% above 1990 levels, so 3%. Now there's 500,000 people in green jobs in California, and am I just 1/500,000th of 3% of a reduction of California emissions, which is only 1% of global emissions? So we have to think at scale. It's like we're talking about the race. It's like we're in a race with climate for our lives, and climate change is just lapping us like 5 times before we even get around the track, and that's how bad the problem is. So we have to scale up, and we have to scale up dramatically and fast. And it's really Greta Thunberg and the teenagers who are really making us think, we need to make this personal. It is about all of us. We are all experiencing climate change, and we all have an impact on affecting climate change as well. And we've got to do things better and more efficiently than we have been doing. This is just my slide to remind us that a lot of emissions are going up. Transportation emissions are going up in California. Most of our emissions are stabilized. The only thing that's really reducing in California is just emissions from electricity sector, but a lot of that is just canceling out-of-state coal contracts. So that 3% is, a lot of it is on paper. So this is the carbon footprint of the typical US household, and this is when I started my work back in 2005. It's got about 5 tons lower than the 50 tons you're showing here. And this is basically taking all emissions in the US economy and allocating those to households. So in other words, as a consumer or an individual, what is the carbon footprint of everything I buy? And that's what you get. And you see a lot of it's indirect, food, goods and services, et cetera. This is our target, 80% below by 2050. And when we'll have achieved that, we will only have achieved the current global average. We need to get 80% below that in order to stabilize the climate. So that's the scale of the problem. That's okay. So this is the carbon footprint in California, and you see transportation is a much larger share here. But also, look what happened to electricity. Electricity is only 5% of the carbon footprint in California of a typical household. In the Bay Area, it's only 2%. In the East Bay, your electricity is only 1% of your carbon footprint. So just focusing on electricity is not getting you very far. We need to electrify everything, though. So electricity is a huge part of the solution, even though it's a small part of the problem for households. And not so the case if you look at elsewhere in the United States. So here's St. Louis, where they have coal still in their homes, and that could be the largest part of your carbon footprint. So you really need to think about tailoring solutions to different locations. We did an analysis a couple years ago of the carbon footprint of every zip code and city and county and state in the US. And you can drill into this. How do we do this? Well, we look at the driving factors of carbon footprints. So things like income, household size, how big the homes are, the percentage of home ownership, the number of vehicles per household, even college degree is an interesting one. Those who have college degrees tend to have more emissions because they express their social status through purchasing more air travel or through eating out or entertainment and so forth, even controlling for income. So we're able to now look at the carbon footprint of every single neighborhood in the United States, and here's the Bay Area. Now, one of the things I wanted to say about some of these East Bay cities is that those driving factors are lower. Vehicle ownership is lower, home ownership is lower, the size of homes is smaller, the people per household is smaller, even though while incomes are larger in many cases like San Francisco. Those other factors drive carbon footprints lower. One of the things, though, that is important about this is not just the size of carbon footprints, but the composition of them. So a household with like 5 people that has low income, food might be the largest part of the carbon footprint. Or a high income household with 2 people, food might be a small part of your carbon footprint. And we find that through cities as well. So I'm just going to go through the last part of my talk here, just looking at this policy scenario tool. You can get that by going to coolclimate.org/scenarios. What we did in this study that we published is we showed that 35% of total emission reduction opportunity from California is within local control. 35%. And we ranked those solutions for every city and every location in the state in this online policy tool. There's the urban infill over there on the left, and then conservation, efficiency, and renewables. We kind of bundled those into those big categories. Renewables is the largest part, followed by efficiency, followed by conservation, followed by urban infill. However, it varies a lot by city. So the way we did our urban infill analysis is we simply said, we looked at the income levels of zip codes in California, and we said, well, the new people who move to California of those income levels, if we can put them where their carbon footprints are lower with the same income level, so no displacing, economically the people who are there, then I just put more people with the same income level in the same location where their carbon footprints are lower. What would be the benefit of doing that? We wanted to find out the benefit of doing that along with all these other policies. And so what we find, and this is really hard to see, I can't even see it myself, honestly. The left is Sacramento and the right is statewide, but you can put in any location, any city or county or even zip code into this. And what we find on the left, that left-hand chart is showing that for Sacramento, that bar that sticks out there, that's urban infill. So the largest opportunity amongst the ones that we've looked at to reduce emissions is urban infill in Sacramento. On the statewide, it's not the top solution. And then you can kind of compare emissions under local reduction opportunities under local control versus total potential. And you can also compare cities. So on the left, we have Sacramento, and on the right, we have Berkeley. So Berkeley and Oakland, it turns out the biggest opportunity that was in with local control that we analyzed is just putting more people here. Now that's gonna increase your greenhouse gas emissions for these cities. So it's important to set emission reduction targets that are per capita, but cities are thinking about their total responsibility to emissions and recognizing that urban infill it plays an important role in reducing emissions. By the way, electrification is the top total emission reduction potential within local control statewide. We wanted to show you as well. So I invite you to explore this tool if you want to look at it. If we can actually meet our targets, we're going to go from something that looks like the upper left-hand quadrant to the lower right-hand quadrant, a world that's much more equitable and a much better world to live in. We just have a lot of work to go, and we need to be smart about which policies we are thinking about implementing in specific locations because they vary really dramatically.
Thank you, Chris. Quick question. So first of all, if you have not gone to coolclimate.org and played around with the dashboard, you should. It's a really awesome way to visualize what cities could be doing in the way of actually reducing their carbon footprints. But you touched on this a little bit, and I want to expand on it. A lot of places, particularly in the Bay Area, if you go to the website and play with the dashboard, urban infill is the top kind of strategy to help reduce carbon footprint, but it's not true of every place. So can you unpack that a little bit? Why would one place be more ripe for urban infill as a climate policy tool versus some other places?
Yeah. Well, our maps, we find that anywhere you look in California, there are good places for urban infill. So while the city of Fresno may not be overall a good place, there are places in downtown Fresno that are really good places for urban infill. And those are the kind of typical things that you might think. The number one driver is vehicles. So less need for vehicles. Vehicle ownership is just lower in those locations pretty dramatically by having one vehicle per household as opposed to 2 or 3. But also the size of the homes are smaller. The home ownership tends to be lower, so that's actually a factor. When people start owning a home, they start consuming more. And then, so those are some of the factors I think that are really important. But there are opportunities pretty much in any city, and I think it is important to, use data to inform policies, because one size does not fit all. That's for sure.
is preaching to the choir. That's what I always say. We have to be using evidence and data as much as we can to be informing these conversations. So thank you. Nina, I'm going to turn it over to you to go over the pre-trip program.
Oh, thank you. There we are. Hold on. It says, hold on. There, can you hear me? Great. No funky feedback? Great. Okay. Before I launch into Transform, I want to take a quick moment. So backpedal a little bit. I want to thank our sponsors for the Connecting Community event series. So pardon me while I read. I would like to thank the American Planning Association, the Northern California chapter, Commute with Enterprise, EAH Housing, which is an affordable housing developer, and the San Mateo County Office of Sustainability, and ZICLA. A lot of love and labor has gone into planning these events, and I would like to thank those organizations for supporting this so we can learn together. Okay, so my name is Nina Rizzo, and I manage the Green Trip certifications at Transform. For those of you that don't know us, we're a nonprofit organization based here in downtown Oakland, and we promote walkable communities with excellent transportation choices so that we can get to where we want to go, keep California affordable, and help solve our climate crisis. So with a diverse array of partners, we engage in planning, we run innovative programs, and we also win policy change at the local, regional, and state levels. So specifically, the Green Trip certification recognizes and supports multifamily developments that are built in smart infill locations, like he was talking about, with affordable housing and traffic reduction strategies so that we show how we can reduce driving, greenhouse gas emissions, and parking demand. Oh, hold on. Went ahead of myself. Oh, you can't really see the map here that well, unfortunately. But imagine the Bay Area with water in the middle of the circle that could be the dots. Oh, you can see it over there? Oh, okay, great. Okay. So all those dots are the 54 Green Trip certified projects that we've done to date. The program's been around for about 10 years. About half of the projects are 100% affordable housing, but overall unit mix, about 35% are below market rate housing projects. And we've been able to work with 31 different housing developers in 21 different Bay Area cities. But what I really want to do next is I want to do a super fast demo for you of this tool that uses, as David was saying, data and research to instantly calculate reductions in driving, greenhouse gas emissions, and parking demand based on a project's location. And so I'm just going to quickly run over there. Actually, can I use the mic? Because I'm going to be on the computer. Great, thank you. Hold on. Oh, there it is. Sorry. I have a PC at home. So it's at connect.greentrip.org. Later, you can watch that super cool video we have. I'm going to go ahead and enter an address of a project I know about in Oakland by the lake. Just so happens to be a project by EAH Housing that is already approved. Some of you may have heard of it. Oh, hold on, I gotta make that bigger. Perfect. Thank you, Edie. So I'm going to quickly select the parcel because that's what draws the data that we have for it. The computer's thinking about it. And then, ooh. Okay. Uh-oh. Sorry, I just want it to select the parcel. There it goes. Okay, So you see the purple parcel, that's where the project is. If I zoom out, then you guys will recognize where this is. You see where that is now by the lake? Okay, so this project is gonna have 53 affordable units. Now, if I knew what the bedroom breakdown was, I could enter those along with square foot and rent, but I don't, so I'm just gonna skip it. I know there's gonna be 22 spaces of residential parking, so I'm gonna enter that. Now, what maybe you see so far happening on the dashboard here is it starts with estimated vehicle miles traveled, and so that's how many miles does one household travel per day, as well as greenhouse gas emissions and parking demand. And that's for an average location in Alameda County. And I can switch it to city and region if I want. And then on the next drop down, you can't read it, but it says if built on selected parcel. So in that particular location, because it's a smart infill location like the other panelists were talking about, you already see those reductions. So next what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep scrolling down here. I'm going to enter the affordable housing. Now we're really proud of this tool because it's the only statewide tool that takes into account the depth of affordable housing when estimating vehicle miles traveled and greenhouse gas emissions. And this is really important. It's important, number one, that we locate affordable housing near transit because that gives those households the opportunity for cheaper and convenient ways to get around. But from a climate policy standpoint, it's also very important because, as he was saying earlier, higher income households own more than twice as many vehicles and drive more than twice as many miles as extremely low income households. And lower income households, they will use transit more. Thank you. They will use transit more even if they're not in a transit-rich neighborhood. But if they are within a quarter mile of good transit, they'll drive 50% less. So I don't want to harp too much on the numbers, but we do have the data that we've done with the California Housing Partner CHPC, California Housing Partnership Corporation. Thank you. Too many acronyms. So, because I'm short of time, I'm not going to do all the different income categories, but for those of you in the housing field, you know that there are different categories for income. So I'm just going to quickly put those in. Next, there's unbundled parking. So as an affordable housing project, this wouldn't do that, but for a load of market rate projects, we do that. Unbundled parking means you're paying for the parking space separate and above paying from rent for housing. And this is a social equity issue because even if you think, oh, this apartment comes with a free parking spot, great, it's actually not free, right? Repeat after me. Parking is never free. Thank you. So research shows that if the parking space is bundled, you're actually paying about 16% of your rent is for the parking space, which is about $142. We know that's more than the Bay Area, right? So that is for people on limited income and can't afford a lot of rent, that's a make or break deal if you can afford that place. Okay. So I'm going to also click on transit passes because I've talked to the developer and they didn't know that AC Transit and a lot of service providers offer bulk discounts for residential development. So they can literally walk into AC Transit, say, hey, I want to give this project transit passes. They can buy it 95% off retail. I know, I see your face. 95% off retail. It's true. And so they can give those transit passes to those residents. Okay, she's telling me I'm done. One more thing. Okay, the coolest part about this, because I want you guys to use it, is you can share it with all your best friends and the planner. So there's this share report. You get this unique URL, which you can't see, but you can copy and paste it to share with people. Okay, I'm done.
Thank you, Nina. Quick follow-up. I can imagine in the not too distant past, it would be really difficult to convince a developer that not to build parking because that's what maybe the market demanded, or if I'm going to charge this much in rent, people are going to demand a parking spot. Is that true today? Do you still find those conversations difficult, or it seems like with tools like this, with so many other policies in place to try and incentivize less parking being built, that they would be more accepted today? Is that what you're finding?
Yes and no. There are some developers that still want to build parking, but actually more likely than not, when I have a conversation with a developer, they are very willing to reduce parking. And they even say like, hey, listen, I've talked to some developers and they say, Nina, I know we're building too much parking, but they're making me do it. I see some nodding heads from people that know this, it's true. But a lot of developers will say, Nina, I'd be more than happy to reduce parking, but the banks won't let me. Because the banks see it as a risky investment. So what Transform did when we were collecting data for our parking database, which I didn't tell you about, we have a free online parking database, is we also showed the occupancy level. Because the banks need to be convinced that even if they don't have a lot of parking, there will still be high occupancy, as in they'd get a return on their money.
Thank you. So thank you, Nina, and thank you to all the panelists for their presentation. So now I'm going to ask some questions just to the panel broadly, and then after that we'll start taking audience questions in the form of those comment cards. So if you have not yet filled out your comment card and you have a question, please do so, and we'll go ahead and collect those. So my first question is really, to me it seems like we kind of know what the solutions are, right? When we talk about building electrification, reducing parking requirements, building in smart infill locations, and so really my question has to do with what organization or governing body should be the one trying to put these strategies into place. We have San Jose and Berkeley that have now banned gas in new buildings. Is that something we should let the cities lead on, or at some point should the state step in? And on land use, we have this conversation a lot, right? Is local control so sacrosanct that the state doesn't have a role in trying to promote or get cities to plan for more infill housing? So really, what is the right mix or balance that we see?
Before I answer that comment, I'd like to make it more complicated. All of us have
Please
been talking about solutions for new development. And the vast majority of change has to happen in existing development. So we need to get gas out of existing homes. We need to, work with our existing infrastructure, and that's a much greater challenge. The new development, we assume, should just be zero carbon anyway, right? So, to make things harder. So who's going to tackle the existing infrastructure? I think that's an important question. One of the challenges is, a lot of times when people get a new, you could ban installation of new gas, for example, or just make sure that you could, there's a lot of policies you could do, but then people will find ways to circumvent that policy, so people don't always get permits when they get something installed. It's really common not to get it permitted. So we have to find ways not just to have policy, but also enforcement as well.
I have a couple favorite state laws I'd like to share. I have to admit I can't keep it up to date with all the different policies that every city is doing. I know some cities are doing really amazing things, like San Francisco has a great new sort of TDM policy, which they focused on green chip. And maybe you've heard of Minneapolis has gotten rid of single family zoning, which is revolutionary, and I really hope more cities follow. But if you disagree with me, I'd like to put a plug in for the book called The Color of Law. How many of you have read it? Awesome. I'm not finished yet, but it is so disturbing, and I so recommend it in terms of a history of residential segregation in our country. But back to my favorite state laws regarding land use. One of them is SB 743, and that relates to our beloved CEQA. So it's timely because July of next year, all the cities in the state will have to switch how they analyze infill projects. So instead of penalizing infill because they're looking at level of service, basically how bad is congestion due to this new infill project, they're going to look at it from a vehicle miles traveled standpoint, and related to that, it treats infill development much more kindly than urban sprawl, which is exactly what we want to see. And my second favorite state law is 733. I'm sorry, 744. And that relates to parking and affordable housing development. So if an affordable housing development is within half a mile of frequent transit, the city, by law, cannot force the developer to build more than 0.5 parking spaces. So it allows more affordable units to be viable. Those are my favorites.
So on the existing buildings, I think there's an important role for both city, state, and if we had a federal government that functioned. I mean, at the city level, there's a tremendous amount of things we can do on building electrification, and all indications are that cities are excited and want to help lead on this. But it's also clear that the state plays a very important role in making sure the state utilities, PG&E, SoCal Gas, SoCal Edison, are all aligning their programs too, so they're not undermining what the cities are doing, and are being treated favorably when they do good things and penalized when they do bad things. I think on land use, The Color of Law, which I'm not quite finished with either, I think is one of the most remarkable books I've read in a long time. Cities are not up to the task of undoing the racist underpinnings of single-family homes. I live in Rockridge, and we can't agree in my community to build anything. That's unacceptable. The city is not, the neighborhood is not solving the problem. So I am clear that the solution, the answer cannot be left to the people of Rockridge. Right? It's not working. It's failing. And there's many great things California is leading on. Sprawl is not one. You saw the terrifying slide about vehicle emissions are up in California. So again, we can pat ourselves on the back for many good things. We have 30 million people who regularly breathe levels of air pollution that are unsafe largely because of transportation. And we can't work out to undo our affinity, our relationship with a single occupancy vehicle. And that requires infill. So there's a lot the cities can do. On some of these things, we just have to concede that they are failing miserably, and we're going to have to do something different at a different level of government, whether it's SB 50 or something like it.
I do have one favorite policy also, is the secondary dwelling unit policy that mandates that cities have to allow secondary dwelling units up to 1,200 square feet, and to kind of make that accessible. That's a policy that can be broadly applied across the entire state. Whereas it does become difficult when you're trying to do a policy and craft that urban infill, for example, policy that's going to work everywhere. That is a case where it actually does pretty much work everywhere, so we have to be careful about crafting state-level policy, making sure that local jurisdictions can modify those when it's necessary.
Couldn't we just do what Minneapolis just did and upzone the entire state to 3 stories?
You heard it here first.
Right, and you have to look for those types of solutions. I think that, that could be broadly applied. Yeah.
So I'd like to discuss the topic of housing and climate, as through the lens of environmental justice. So, specifically, we know that our most vulnerable communities oftentimes bear the brunt of our inability to tackle environmental issues, and their voices are oftentimes, not included in conversations and how to address these issues. So when it comes to the intersection of housing and climate, how can we ensure that we understand how our decisions or indecisions impact the most vulnerable among us, and how do we ensure that the solutions moving forward really include these voices in those conversations?
Okay. Thank you for bringing that up, David. For those of us that have done like organizing or worked on environmental justice or climate justice, there are some guidelines from people of color, from sort of community-based organizations that have given us as guidance for the 10 sort of climate justice policies. There are 2 that I'll mention. One of them is that pretty basic. We have to stop cooking the planet. And number two is that the United States must lead. So we who live in the United States are responsible for about 25% of the world's emissions, but we only have about 5% of the population, which means those of us that are used to a lot of comfort and convenience have to let that go if we're going to get anywhere. In terms of what transformed us, part of environmental justice, which you mentioned, David, is not only looking at outcomes and that the burdens and benefits are evenly and fairly distributed, but also about the engagement process, self-determination. Are people part of the decision-making process? And so I want to sort of share a couple programs that we have at Transform that I think really emulate that. One of them, my colleagues Joy Macy and David Beezer are working on mobility hubs at 3 affordable housing sites in the Bay Area. And so we got some funding, and a lot of it was about car sharing, like just put car share pods on those sites. And we pushed back a little bit, and we're like, actually, we want to do a needs assessment. Let's ask them, how do you get around? How do you want to get around? What would be helpful to you? And not only did we ask them those questions to get a reality check of, does car sharing make sense for them in those places, but we also engaged them in the design of the survey and the dissemination of the survey and reporting the information back to them. So as you can imagine, it's been a very long and iterative process, but that's what community engagement looks like. And so what they're finding and reporting back to the Air Resources Board is actually this is what they say would help them get around better. And it isn't necessarily car sharing. It's a wide array of things. And we also host the Alameda County Safe Routes to School team, and they are definitely working with the people being the kids, the adults, the school staff, on how can the kids get to school and back home safely, what works for them. And so that when they leave the school, the program, they're already set up to keep on going themselves. So I don't want to take up too much time, but those are some things I wanted to share that we're doing at Transform. But also we recognize very humbly that we're not necessarily a grassroots organization, and we do aspire to be an anti-racist organization. And there are steps that we're taking to do that, but we have to acknowledge that we're not there yet. And when it comes to environmental justice, there's always so much that we could be doing better.
So I think at a state level, we can allocate resources effectively. One of the ways in which cap and trade money is distributed right now is by identifying marginalized communities. And that's really a broad brush stroke. If you are a marginalized community in the East Bay, you don't qualify for that money in most cases because you're not on the map. So we really need to think about where we target individuals as opposed to targeting locations. It's some work that I think needs to be done. The biggest problem that I see in terms of why we're not solving this problem is a massive misallocation of talent, resources, and effort. So we need to think about where our resources can be most effective, and in many cases, it's identifying individuals and communities at small spatial resolution, not big macro tools like we're using with our current policy. And it's a bit of a sort of into the weeds a bit on the details, but we have to kind of step back and look at where the money is going and is it being distributed effectively. And that's probably a much more important conversation that we should be having than getting down to often my daily work. We should maybe think about the systemic change as well.
I would just say very quickly on, as we think about, we have 12 million buildings in California burning gas and some propane. If we're going to move the people who currently burn gas in an equitable way off of gas onto electricity, it is critically important that transition gets designed and implemented and informed by all the critical voices. If you think about the cost of maintaining the gas distribution system, if only those who could afford to pull out of the system, you are left with the system costs going up for the remaining customers. And so you could end up with an enormously inequitable situation where half the population leaves the gas distribution system and the cost of maintaining it double, and the price per customer who is left, which will be the people who can least afford it, will see their bills skyrocket. So we're very fortunate. The Green Lining Institute just put out an awesome report at the beginning of this conversation about how do we decarbonize 12 million buildings here in California, about how to design it in an equitable way at the front end, to have an inclusive process at the front end. So if you're interested in this subject, their report that came out 2 weeks ago is a great primer on how to design the system and do it right at the front end, so we don't look back 2 years from now and be like, oops, we forgot, and look who's paying the cost of what's left on the gas system.
Thank you all for answering that so thoughtfully. I have one more question I will pose to the group, and then we'll move into the comments we received from the audience, which are all really great. Keep them coming if you still have them. We still have a good amount of time. So, Bruce, we chatted a little bit about how actually banning gas in new buildings can actually be cost savings, which actually is a bit rare in as these things go, because as we talk about creating more energy efficient buildings, more often than not, we see these things actually add cost to a building, right? So we have Title 24 requirements that require thicker walls and whatnot, different materials. And so really, my question is, how do we balance the need to build energy efficient homes with the need to build more housing overall? Is that's something we look at as the just exploding cost to build new housing in California. Makes it really hard to build affordable housing. Our subsidy dollars, they don't go as far. It makes it hard to make market rate housing that is affordable to anyone except for those at the top income level. So again, the question, how do we balance the need to build really green new buildings, but also with an eye towards making sure we can actually build them?
I think we all have something to say, but please.
I'm going to bounce my response back to you, Bruce, and I'll let you answer. So, to pull you in on the conversation as well. I mean, David, sorry. David, I think instead of just answering the questions, asking, you may be able to answer that one yourself. So.
Oh, that's not allowed.
Is that allowed?
That's
is that
not
part
allowed.
of the rules? Everything has to change. Listen to Greta. Everything has to change, and everything will, whether you like it or not. So
well, sure. So when we talk a lot about balancing the various priorities, not just climate priorities, that housing should be meeting, we often talk about making sure that it works within the environment with which housing gets built. So for example, if you are going to require something that adds costs, can you do something that makes up for that in another part of the building? So we talk a lot about this in requiring, say, affordable housing on site. Can you offer, say, a density bonus or streamline the entitlement process so that, yes, you have added some costs or you've reduced some revenue, but you've made up for it in other places. So I don't know what that looks like with respect to a lot of policies that come down from the California Air Resource Board, from building code updates. But I guess my point is that those conversations, they don't happen. They are, they are made and they are kind of layered onto the overall cost to build. And so we have this compounding problem of we need to build densely, we need to build in infill areas, but it's expensive to do so. And so if we can't do that, then it gets pushed to the Central Valley, where, as you know, and your work has shown, that more people own cars and more people are going to drive a lot more. And so we've actually done something that may be counterproductive. So,
Can I jump on it?
Yes.
Okay. Two things. I want to come back to the more homes in the Central Valley piece, but to more directly answer the question of how to make housing cheaper. Who here wants to take a guess at how expensive it is to build one parking space in a structure? And Jennifer West, you cannot answer. Okay, I see one hand. What do you think? Yes, he's right. It's about $50,000 for one space in a structured parking lot. Okay, now I want another person to guess how expensive it is if you go underground. Yeah, in the glasses. Super close. You guys are smart. Very well informed. Why am I here? Yeah, it's about $80,000 to go underground. So that's no chump change. So when a developer can right-size parking, reduce parking, they can save money, and that space can be used for units or other amenities instead. And I also, going back to what David was saying about homes in the Central Valley, I want to share a horror story with you. It'll only take 30 seconds. Okay, how many of you have sat through a planning commission meeting for a housing project in the Bay Area? Yes, I think we all feel that way. Hours, right? They could go into 2 in the morning. How many of you have sat in a planning commission for housing projects in the Central Valley? Oh, okay, well, if your experience is different than mine, please let me know. I had the joy, I guess, no, that's not right. I sat through a planning commission hearing in Fresno, where I live now because of the housing crisis. And the whole meeting took only 30 minutes, and they rubber stamped a suburban tract map, I say about 50 single-family homes, over farmland, in about a minute. Just they went down the aisle, no commissioners asked no questions, no discussion, they just voted yes, do it. And so I think I want us to realize that when we're giving infill development such a hard time here, what's happening is that we're seeing the sprawl, and not the cool kind of development in Fresno downtown. Like, they're literally going over farmland and building single-family homes, which increases the greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector. So we're right, we're failing. That's the horror story. It's almost Halloween.
I would push back on the efficiency piece, because we know that a lot of people struggle to come up with, in the event of emergency, to cover a $400 bill. And I think about the California incentives in this state, where I today, because of the solar and the secondhand EV I bought, the total amount I pay per month to power my entire house, 1,600 square feet, and my car, all the time, is $10 a month. From an equity perspective, not being hit with a $200, $300, $400 a month utility bill is a huge, huge issue. So how do we do this so that we don't think about the cost of the upfront construction separate from the operating? Because it's when you live paycheck to paycheck or health crisis to health crisis, when something goes wrong and you can't afford a utility bill, it has profound knock-on benefits. So I actually think when we make homes more efficient and we help people keep their bills as small as humanly possible, including with the new solar mandate, which is a mandate which will increase the upfront cost of housing, it will shrink one of the big things that makes people particularly vulnerable, which is their high utility bills. So I do think we want to wrestle with this, which is how do we help people get into homes where there aren't huge costs every month, which create enormous uncertainty. So I think there's an important conversation in that.
Great, thank you. So we're going to transition now into your comments. I'm going to do my best to get through as many as I can, or might consolidate them if they're similar, but we have a lot. This is a very inquisitive group, which is good. You're listening. So the first question actually does kind of get to what are the incentive programs that are out there. So this person writes that I'm kicking myself because we renovated an older home 5 years ago and installed a new gas stove. You've heard this before. Gas dryer and gas hot water heater. Are there any incentive programs for homeowners, or for that matter landlords, who would like to replace their gas appliance with electric ones?
Well, a year ago there wasn't. Even though an electric hot water heater, electric furnace is 3 to 4 times more efficient than the most efficient gas appliance, in California it was illegal for utilities to give you incentives to fuel switch from gas to electric. That has all changed, thanks to great works by Sierra Club NRDC, who petitioned the commission saying this is an outdated, inconsistent with our climate change goals. We got to get rid of this prohibition on fuel switching. So today, if you're in PG&E service territory, you can get an incentive to purchase new electric appliances. They're not as generous as they should be. If you live in Sacramento and had a single-family home, you could get up to $13,000 to replace all of your gas appliances with electric. So the awesome folks at the municipal utility are doing sort of the groundbreaking work of actually helping people get off of fossil fuels entirely. We are starting in the Bay Area to do so, and hopefully over time, particularly with the new CCA, the new community choice aggregation provider, we're actually going to have more incentives coming down the pipe. But it used to be no incentives. Today there are important incentives available through PG&E.
I'd like to add a behavior element to this discussion. That incentives may be available, but do people know about them, others than those who come here, and how do we get the information out? I think it is really important. There are programs that if you're low income, you qualify for a whole range of energy efficiency improvements in your home, and people just don't know about it. So I'll share a story with my mother. I've been working in this field, I had been for 15 years already, and the only time she went and got a full home energy upgrade is when somebody who was her age, a woman, called her on the phone and started talking to her and engaged my mother in this conversation that I could never have. And then, I had nothing to do with it. And I showed up and like, what's going on here? And all these improvements to your home, new water heater, energy efficient, everything, new heating system. Like, she's like, yeah, this woman called me and she talked to me. So we so we have to find ways, failure. So we have to find ways to engage our communities in ways that understand, the social motivations for change, and including making these messages really local as possible.
Awesome. Next, there's two questions that are somewhat related, so I'm going to mix them together. So if you don't recognize it, I apologize. So a friend of mine in Berkeley says that banning gas in homes will not be effective because power still comes from a dirty grid. So what are the most powerful points I can make against this line of thinking? And also, this was a question specific for you, Chris. Does the data set for cool climate neighborhoods include the amount of California imported energy, and also maybe perhaps per capita air travel?
I'll just start with the cool climate question. Yes, it's important that you look at the carbon intensity of both the power that's owned and operated by the utility, as well as all purchased emissions. You don't always get that unless it's a third-party verified assessment, so be careful out there when you look at the carbon intensity of electricity. It's not always accurate, but yes, we certainly do look at that. We also look at imports and exports out of the country. So your goods, we look at the carbon intensity of the good where it originates, just kind of on average. So yeah, it's carbon footprinting for me. I enjoy it because it's like tracking dollars through the economy, but it also tracks emissions through the economy. And you can look at all those flows and try to figure out where the choke points are that you can make the reductions.
So the real quick, so our electricity in California is on its way to zero. The good news, you mentioned electricity makes up about 1% of our carbon footprint in the Bay Area because we are well ahead of the rest of the state. We did analysis last year that everywhere in the United States today, even in places where they're still burning coal, you are better off switching from gas in your home to electric in your home from a carbon footprint perspective, and it will only get better over time. Because despite what Trump is doing, we are retiring about one coal plant a month and building record amounts of clean energy. Do we need to go faster? Absolutely. Is the electricity carbon zero yet? No, but it is already clean enough that you are better off net, and particularly here in the Bay Area where we have a very high supply of clean energy, to be switching from gas over to electric. And in part, it's remembering that the highest efficiency of your gas furnace is about 97%. The heat pump technology is 300 to 400 times efficient. So it is 3 to 4 times more efficient to be using electricity in your homes to power the same devices as if they were powered by gas. So you've got much more efficient devices, and you already have a super clean electricity. Net, you are much better off with electric than gas.
Here's a question about transportation. So what advice do you have for more suburban areas? For example, BART was extended to Antioch. And guess what new housing is being built by the station? Single-family homes. Density can seem too radical for suburban areas. How can we change this? Easy answer.
SB 50.
Would you like to speak about it?
No.
So there is this argument in that I think it's important to consider that extending transit just extends sprawl, and that's a conversation that's been happening for decades in the Bay Area. And there's certainly some truth to that. It depends on what type of housing you build, and that is, you're certainly pointing to the right question, because those transit stops are good places to build, but what actually gets built there, it doesn't have to. Also, there's another problem we addressed in another paper, that urban infill without boundaries upon your infill is just going to encourage sprawl. It's like pouring sand on a map. The more you pour in the middle without right policies, it just spreads. So we looked at the carbon footprint of metropolitan areas in the United States, and we found that large metropolitan areas, even like New York and Chicago and wherever you look, have higher overall carbon footprints when you add up all the people in the suburbs that are supported by that metropolitan area. And more people just means more sprawl. So what you need to do is, put a cup on the map and pour your sand in the cup and prevent people from sprawling. And that's what they've done. Like an urban growth boundary in Portland has been effective, and it's something we really need to consider. We need to not just look at your city, but you need to look at the entire region when you're crafting your policy, because otherwise it's just going to squish out. There's going to be consequences that are outside your control.
Sorry guys, that was really embarrassing, but I have dry eyes. I'm not crying over the question, but I kind of am. So just because I happen to live in Fresno now, and the question is like, how do you sort of support transit and build denser and suburban areas? And Fresno is largely single-family homes. There is a downtown, and recently they've done a very revolutionary thing, which is they've changed the zoning in order to allow mixed use. So if you can imagine, mixed use was just not allowed. You could not do it. And they've also increased the height limit, so by right, you can build up to 10 stories high in downtown Fresno. It's amazing. And we have Dan Zach to thank for that. He actually came from Redwood City, transformed Redwood City, and then boomeranged back home to Fresno. So we're crossing our fingers that maybe in 10 years, downtown Fresno will actually have more density and be a more sort of walkable city. And in terms of the Bay Area here, what to do about that, unfortunately, because of the way, unfortunately, housing is a real estate investment instead of a human right. And I think until we start treating it in policy as a human right instead of a real estate investment, we're going to continue to have trouble to build denser, especially along transit, because people have vested interests in their wealth accumulation. And last year, the National Association of Realtors showed data that 75% of white people are homeowners, and only about 45% of black people are homeowners. So when a development is proposed, and cities have a requirement to notify homeowners and landowners within a certain area, guess who gets invited to that public decision-making process? So it's a much more sort of structural problem that we have, and I don't have the answers.
I'm sorry, I want to jump in because I do have one other answer that would take a lot of political will, but we could have a fee-bait program on development. So if you're in Fresno, if you want to build sprawl around Fresno, that's great, you can build that, you're just going to have to pay for it. And all of that money is going to be used to encourage infill. Fee-baits work on a lot of things. They could work on vehicles and appliances, but they can also work into urban housing, and it's revenue neutral. It costs, there's no just incentives that you're giving. Incentives are regressive. They're a cost, a tax to everybody, and you're just allocating those taxes dollars to somebody that you choose, and many types, the people who actually get the incentives are wealthy people and not those who really need it. So we need to be careful about how we allocate our money and incentives.
So question on building materials. So the question is, can you address building materials? Building with concrete for taller buildings for density, but presumably this increases your emissions, right? So is there an alternative way that we should be building more densely to realize GHG emissions reductions as well?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question. Can you repeat the question?
So traditionally, if we go over 7 stories, we're building with concrete and steel. If we were to do things like mass timber or whatnot, would that have an important impact on the GHG emissions from the construction of new, denser building, which we know we need for other reasons?
You know, my training is in life cycle assessment, so I should be able to answer this question, but I found it so dry that I gave up on life cycle assessment, you know, a while ago, and I'm not up on the latest technologies as well as like the latest cements and so forth that you know have low carbon. So
You're
I'm
not
sorry.
on the top of the latest cements?
It's important. I really recognize this, but there are other people who are doing that. I actually got into behavior work in the last 10 years as well as our kind of policy and carbon footprint work, and that's way more interesting.
So I would just say real quickly, I don't claim to be an expert on, quote, embedded carbon, which is what's the carbon content of our steel and cement and other building materials. I will say it is an area that's getting increasing attention. People talk about carbon emissions from transport, buildings, electricity sector, and then they have this industrial sector, which is largely building materials. And so there's 2 ways you can think about it. How do you address the industrial sector, or how do you actually build better buildings, and how do you build better vehicles that have less embedded carbon in them? So it is a critical conversation because we use an enormous amount of fossil fuels to do both cement and steel. But the fascinating thing is that a lot of steel use and most of the cement use is used in our urban areas, of course. And so cities could actually begin thinking about how do they set their building codes and other things like how they build highways and transit lines in ways that incentivize the providers to be producing a lot lower carbon products. I recently found out that we actually still do burn coal in California. We have 8 cement kilns that provide the cement to build our urban areas and our freeways and our sidewalks, and it's powered with coal. And there hasn't been much conversation about that to date. It's starting to slowly happen, but it is a unfinished piece of our business to both understand and then think about what are the smart policies to begin to abate that large, currently unregulated source of emissions.
Great, thank you. And this question, I think is for Bruce as well, and then you kind of explained this a bit earlier, and I think maybe if you can dig a little bit deeper into this, but electrifying homes is undoubtedly good for the environment, but how are we thinking about spreading the same fixed costs of the gas system over a shrinking number of residents, often the poorest residents?
So the headline coming out of the Berkeley hearing was Berkeley, first city in the country, arguably the globe, to ban gas in new buildings. I would argue there was actually a very important subheading, which was Pacific Gas and Electric supported it. Pacific Gas and Electric is one of the 5 largest sellers of gas in the entire United States. They showed up at a hearing in Berkeley and said, we support the ban, and we support the beginning of a conversation about how do we unwind our gas assets. That was a profoundly important marker, and they continued and supported San Jose and the other 9 jurisdictions that have done that. To do it equitably, and one of the reasons they support this conversation getting started sooner rather than later, that if this is done in a haphazard way, 1 every 10 homes pulls out of the gas system, we keep the same fixed costs. If we do this neighborhood by neighborhood and literally trim the gas tree in an orderly way, we can save enormous amounts of money on maintenance and then use those savings to actually help electrify. So the really important answer here is this has to be done in an orderly way to make sure it is equitable and we don't leave people behind bearing the weight of that system, particularly those who can least afford it.
As important as good data is, the opposition to climate-friendly policies isn't amenable to data arguments, according to this person. How do we change local policies when we run into decision makers who may not be open to hearing evidence-based approaches?
That's a really good point. I sort of agree with it. At Transform, we really pride ourselves with collecting a lot of data, doing a lot of research, and sharing it for free with people. And we try to use that information to guide policymaking. But I can't tell you how many times I have done my sort of one-woman show presentation about multifamily and all the data that we have behind this Connect tool, and they just want to know my story. They just want to know, well, Nina, how do you live? How do you get around? And that the most convincing thing I can do is sort of share my own story as an anecdote, sort of like both of how I was like the perfect example of infill resident and then became the worst example of, now living all the way out in Fresno. And telling that story is actually what moves a lot of people, because on a lot of planning commissions or city councils or staffers, I'm not talking to someone that looks like me or that's my age. I'm usually talking to someone who's a generation or two older than me, who has a very different lifestyle, is probably a homeowner, probably makes at least twice as much as I do, and has grown up with a white picket fence, and maybe their parents had white picket fences. And so they actually need to hear from someone that's different, that says, I don't live like you, and I don't want to live like you, and my 50 friends don't want to live like you either. And so that's actually what kind of moves the needle, believe it or not, even though we all have swarms of data.
We organize, right? I mean, in 2002, we were facing almost 200 proposed coal plants across this country, and there were a lot of us who had the data and said, look, the data says you build these coal plants, the planet is fried. But it was the grassroots activists in Muhlenberg County, Kentucky, who stood up to Peabody and defeated one of the largest proposed coal plants in the United States in the heart of coal country. When the coal industry wanted to build 5 new coal export facilities from Oakland up to Bellingham, Washington, it was a coalition of Native American tribes in Montana, people living along the routes, who all came together and said, over our dead bodies, are you going to be exporting coal out of the United States and fueling this climate crisis? So data is important, and we are very big fans at Rocky Mountain Institute of data, but we are up against some very, very powerful forces where we're not going to win unless we're super organized and we're super smart about making sure we have broad, diverse coalitions who are actually standing up to the moneyed interest and saying, we can do much better and we demand much better.
Yeah, I definitely think personalizing the issue and also collective action are just really critical, and I can speak to our programs. We run statewide programs like the Cool California Challenge that engage 34 cities across California in behavior change. We just recently completed the Cool Campus Challenge, where we engaged 22,000 staff, student, and faculty at all 10 University of California campuses. And when we asked the participants, it was a great way to do research because they all filled out a research survey. We give them points for doing all kinds of actions, like you take a photo of yourself, getting on the bus, and you get points for it. And so we were able to use gamification and also a lot of social motivations to encourage people to take action. But when we asked them about their belief in their ability to create a meaningful change on it as an individual, about 60% of the young people said, yes, I believe my personal action makes a difference. But when we asked them about their belief in their ability to create meaningful change in their campus through collective action, it was over 90%. So collective action, it's what empowers us. You can get disempowered because you realize as an individual, you cannot solve this huge problem. I, as a researcher, have been working this for 17 years, and I realize am I making a difference, right? Even through all of our work. As an individual, you cannot solve climate change, but you can make your community greener. You can make your household greener. You can make your business, your place of work better. And those are problems that we can actually address and solve, and that collective action is empowering and really powerful. So we need to tap into those motivations, make it personal, look to the youth. They're shaking us up. Honestly, I feel like Greta is about the only one who's making very much sense lately. She's the only one who's really taking this problem as serious as it needs to be taken. So we need to kind of work with each other to deal with this issue, and maybe have some, group grief sessions or something. But yeah, we've got to get through this together.
So I want to piggyback on this question of people who are resistant to data, because I think it feeds into a larger theme of people being resistant to change, even those you might think who shouldn't be resistant to certain types of change. We saw this play out at the state level when SB 827 came out and SB 50 came out, that there was a bit of a rift in the environmental advocacy community. You had some groups who were opposed to it and others who were really in favor of it. So any thoughts on why that rift exists when we have, it just seems like overwhelming data that really there is no real path to meeting our environmental goals without significant urban infill? So thoughts on that?
I think a lot of the rift in the environmental community has been very helpful in making better policy. A lot of the resistance to some of the early California climate policy was from an environmental justice perspective, and now our policy explicitly has environmental justice and greenhouse gas equity as well as health goals. So I think that that's meaningful, but at the same time, we cannot fall into the Rockridge problem of never coming up with a solution because we're trying to come up with a perfect solution. Because we need to act as if our house is on fire. We need to be aggressive in what we're doing, but we need to be thoughtful about it as well. So I don't think we should panic, but I think we should be very thoughtful. But I think we do need to focus. Sorry, that wasn't exactly related to your question, but I had to get that out there.
At Transform, I'm not the one that was directly involved with 825 and SB 50, so I would have to, our expert of that matter is our legislative policy director in Sacramento, Joshua Stark. And if you want to get into the details of what we think about it, it's in a blog off our website. But what I will share is that it was a very complicated situation, and because we build coalitions and listen to a lot of different organizations that we work with, we did not ultimately sort of support or not support. There were some things in those bills that we really liked related to land use and density and infill development, but there were also some things that we wanted to see improved before we were going to really come out and support it 100%. And a lot of those things related to affordability, renter protections, being more sensitive to geography because, we're here in a bubble, but all California is not like cool Oakland. And, so a lot of that could be fixed with a better process, really listening and engaging all the stakeholders up front before the bill sort of got drafted, got so far, and then people got upset what was in it. And the same thing happened with SB 50. So the good news is Transform has been working on the intersection of all these issues for a very long time, and these bills were the first time that they were so high profile and had garnered so much attention and got really close, and yet we couldn't fully support it because it was very complicated and there were some things we wanted improved, and you could go to our website for more information.
Full disclosure, I am also a Rockridge resident, so, but I don't think I fall into that same camp. But it is an interesting dynamic because we have a lot of, and it's not just a Rockridge issue, I think it's a affluent area issue that, especially in California, where we pride ourselves on being the home of the resistance and wanting to do right by climate policy, but then when it comes time to support projects in our neighborhood, or whether it's affordable or market housing, we have a little bit of heartburn on, whoa, that's actually going to happen here. Is that really, am I really okay with that? So it's really, to me, having that hard conversation with ourselves, saying, are we going to be really part of the solution? Because if you look at where housing is being built in Oakland, it's in places that have traditionally been marginalized. It's in the MacArthur area, West Oakland, around us in downtown. The really wealthy areas, they're not really building as much as they probably would be, absent some sort of city policy or perhaps a statewide tool to make them do that. So I have been told that we are just about to wrap, so 2 points. First is thank you all very much for coming. This has been an incredibly insightful conversation for me. I hope it's been helpful for everyone here. My second point is I apologize if I did not get to your card. We had so many that I was not able to get to all of them, so please know that I did try to get to as many as we could. But I want to close with one thing, one last kind of overarching question for the panel. It really is one of the questions from the crowd is, what immediate actions can an individual or corporation do to help with this issue broadly?
So I would start by saying inform yourself and start doing an assessment of what your carbon footprint is and what your opportunities are. However, I think it's really important to understand our spheres of influence. It's not just about your own personal carbon footprint. It's how you interact with your peers at your place of work, within your community as an activist. So for those who think, they're not having children because they're worried about the negative aspect of the carbon footprint of that having children, you may be exactly the person who should be having the child, because maybe your child's going to solve this problem. So, we need to think about our total impact, and it may not be personal, it may be policy, maybe community, maybe organizing something else.
Connect, Green Trip Connect. How many of you right now know of a project that you want to try this on? Oh, that's, okay, you scared me for a second. A few of you do. Please go to your local city planning commission website, what projects there are, and see if there's any apartment buildings, and then use this tool and go there and say, please build it. And tell them how much money they're going to save on reduced parking, that we're not going to get traffic, and we really need this infill development, or else we're still going to have sprawl. There was one other thing I wanted to say. I forget what it is, but thank you so much for coming. Please use Green Trip Connect. If you have any questions, please reach out so that we can help you use it. This is a tool, as you could see, it was super easy to use. Anyone can use it, and we really wanted to get it into the hands of community members like the folks over here that live in Rockridge.
I'll help you. I'll go door to door.
Awesome. We have a taker. Do we have another taker? Okay, we have another one. Thank you.
I would just say that the news on climate change is not a happy one right now. And if we're honest, it's probably going to get worse. But everything we do to mitigate it from here on out makes it a lot easier going forward. And so whatever inspires you, my underlying recommendation is just get engaged in whatever way you can, whether that's at the local community level where they're fighting infill projects, going door to door to promote them, or getting engaged, running for office, voting, helping elect good people. There's a lot of good stuff you can do, and the best antidote to despair is action.
Thank you very much, Bruce, and to all of our panelists this evening. Thank you, yes, go ahead. Before we let you go for the evening to join the party outside, I want to hand it over to our hosts just to do some announcements.
Thank you. My name's Edie Irons. I'm the Communications Director at Transform. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for staying till the end and hearing this wonderful presentation. Let's hear it again for our panel. This event is all about the intersection between two extremely urgent issues for us right now, and Transform and an incredible list of co-hosting organizations, including urban environmentalists and SFHAC, are among them. And I just want to make sure you saw these on the back of your programs for this evening. There's a list of at least 8 upcoming events, more may be added, all around intersections of transportation, housing, climate, and equity. So we know that these problems are all connected. We can't solve one at a time. We don't have time to solve them one at a time. So I hope you'll keep the learning going. Most, if not all, of these events will be live streamed, and we've got 2 that are online, and they're all coming up in the next 6 weeks or so, October and November. So you can find out all the information here. Thank you again to the sponsors. Thanks, Nina, for mentioning them. But again, as the American Planning Association Northern California chapter, Commute with Enterprise, EAH Housing, and the San Mateo County Office of Sustainability. I should also mention these events are happening all over the Bay Area. So thank you again for coming. Thanks for your great questions, and hope you take those actions.
Thank you all again. Have a good night.